Robin, I think it's important for us in terms of what we've been doing historically to define African history over time, all the way from our early civilizations to the present. We've done it in a very, shall we say, historical fashion in terms of dates and movements of people and governments. I want us to kind of go back to first principles and go back to how our Nile civilizations were developed. Since we know that, you know, the origin of man was certainly in Northeast Africa and also probably in Southern Africa. I'm not sure how you distinguish those two, but certainly the sort of Rift Valley type thing, which is fairly extensive. And that was something going back, you know, shall we say 150 to 200,000 years. So there's a considerable development period within the continent as well as our migration outside of the continent. But essentially, though, the first human civilizations were created in Africa. You know, whether we call them initially Ethiopia, Nubia, Kush, what name we call it from there. But then as they migrated down the Nile Valley into Kemet, or what's being called Egypt today. And that's a civilization that we have most of the artifacts from, more extensive than the earlier civilizations. So, and I think, you know, the things that are important in terms of discussing, let's say, spirituality, because I think spirituality is essential when we're talking about Africans, African history, African culture, African traditions, because we're a people who I think understand the primacy of spirit in terms of our native being. And that we're made of the spiritual and the physical, and the mental is in between, shall we say, transmitting the spiritual to the physical. So it's important for us then to look at our spiritual history, and certainly the pyramid texts, the coffin texts later on, but the pyramid texts initially were in the sarcophagi, etc., and in the burial places of the shall we say, the dignitaries of the Egyptian civilization from way back 3000 BC. Certainly we know that they're the earliest spiritual and philosophical works in the entire world. Can you take us a little bit through that in terms of pyramid texts, how they were found, where they were found, etc., etc.?
The
we're going to end up with a discussion about spirituality and religion, and as you end up with that.
Certainly. Yeah, the pyramid texts, they date back to the period of the 5th ruling dynasty in ancient Egypt. And the very first pyramid texts appeared on the walls of Pharaoh Unas. And Pharaoh Unas is one of the 5th dynasty rulers. Now, we divide ancient Egypt's history into the Old Kingdom, which is dynasties 1 to 6, Middle Kingdom, which is dynasties 11 and 12, and then New Kingdom, which is dynasties 18, 19, 20. So dynasty 5 is very far back, and you've got all kinds of estimates for how long ago that was. Some people say that was 4,000 years ago. Some people say that was 6,000 years ago. And what the pyramid text charts is Pharaoh Unas's passage into the underworld. You could call it the netherworld. And ultimately, he ascends to join Ra. And that became one of the original beliefs of what would happen to you in your afterlife. You would aim to join Ra. Ra is, of course, the sun, or the spiritual power behind the sun. And as far as we know, the pyramid texts are the oldest body of religious writings in the world. And at the same time, there were writings by a very famous ancient Egyptian prime minister, and his name was Ptah-hotep. And his book is called The Maxims of Ptah-hotep. And there was a book that was published in the early 1900s, where they called it the oldest books in the world. There was a guy called Myers who reproduced the writings of Ptah-hotep. Now, Ptah-hotep's philosophy was about the importance of doing ma'at. And ma'at, she's a goddess that represents truth, that represents the law, that represents justice, that represents righteousness. And ma'at, she's sometimes shown with wings. And so with wings, this is where the Western world came up with the idea of angels. She's also representative of the scales, and the scales of balance, and this represents justice. And the European concept of Libra, which is also the scales. Libra has evolved into Lady Justice. So in many European countries, you'll see justice represented as a blindfolded woman holding out a sword, and then coming off the sword are the scales, the balance, which represents this balance of between right and wrong, and as a way of symbolizing justice. And these ideas the ancient Egyptians had certainly as early as the 5th dynasty. The 5th dynasty is where we can prove they had the ideas because they're on the walls. And then from there, the ideas evolve through the coffin texts, where the same writings are now on coffins. And then by the time we get to the 13th dynasty, we start to see new texts coming out. And these new texts are adding to the frame of reference that eventually becomes known as the Book of the Dead. Some people call it Peret Emheru. Peret Emheru is coming forth during the day, coming forth by day. And this is how the ideas develop. Now, what the early African civilizations, and the oldest two were Nubia and ancient Egypt, they realized that religion can be a very, very important tool of building civilization. And it does it at the state level, it does it at the individual level. And so with religion, spirituality is, if you like, a quarter of a religion, giving the inward expression of a religion. Rituals give the outward expression of a religion. Ethics is then the code of what is right and wrong. And futurism is where the religion will tell you what will happen in the future or what would happen in your future. And the ancient Egyptian and Nubian tradition has all of this in there, represented on one hand by the pyramid texts and on the other hand by the maxims of Ptah-hotep.
Mm-hmm. I think, you know, that's very informative. Yeah, I think also that traditionally over time, the shall we say the cosmogony and the cosmology of the universe and how Egypt itself developed, and then how human beings are developed, meaning on the evolutionary scale as the highest evolutionary animal or manifestation of the divine, was also being taught at one of these 4 centers. Certainly, we know that at Hermopolis, what was one, Heliopolis was another one, certainly Memphis, and then Thebes. And if you look at Hermopolis, where Thoth or Tehuti, the wisdom deity, was supposed to be in charge, if you will, meaning and of course that simply means understanding the basis of creation and creativity. And this is something that we have as a cosmology that the West doesn't have, because the West begins with the Big Bang theory. And all of a sudden, you know, there's this explosion, and there's an explosion, and matter is created in nanoseconds or what have you, but nobody knows what happened before. That does not exist in terms of Western scientific understanding. Everything starts then with the creation of matter. And let's say that was, what, 12 billion years ago or something, you know, of that nature. But, you know, we go before that, and we say before that, we had what's described as Hermopolis, which is those 8 figures, shall we say, in the primeval new, which is kind of the watery substance out of which all creation came. And we have new and non-net. And again, we see how we have the opposites, the unity of duality. We don't have one versus the other. We have new and non-net, which really means formlessness and then form. We have hey and hey het, which means infinity and eternity, but then you can get space-time. That's the opposite polarity. You have Kirk and Kirket, and which is darkness, but darkness gives rise to light. Again, you have the polarity of that, and then you have Amun and Amunet, which you have consciousness of self and consciousness of things. So this is the beginning, shall we say, of creation. And out of that then came Amun, Ra, and Ptah. And Ta is the intellectual principle, and so on and so forth. And then if you want to kick in here, because we need also to go to Heliopolis as the next step.
Yeah, the idea of the Hermopolitan cosmology, as they call it. This is the idea that there were 8 primordial ancestors represented as male-female pairs. And why male-females? Because males and females represent potential, and the potential is the potential to reproduce. And that reproduction, then, as you say, Nun and Nornet, Hu and Horhat, Kuk and Korket, Amen and Amenet. And what comes out of these are things: finiteness, light, and visibility. And these ideas had a big impact on later civilizations, as we shall see, because when the Guyanese philosopher, Professor George G.M. James, wrote Stolen Legacy, he noticed, wait a minute, don't some of the ancient Greek ideas sound a little bit like this? And that was a big thing. And then when scholars looked at, well, what were the ancient Egyptians at the city of Heliopolis, the city of Ra, what were they teaching? And they also begin with the primeval waters of Nun, and then Ptah comes out of it, and Ptah coming out of it representing stability. And then we've got Atum Ra representing the sun, and then Atum Ra creates 2 elements: Shu, air; Tefnut, water. So what have we got? We've got and then out of that comes Geb, earth; Nut, some people say sky, some people say fire. So you've got earth, air, water, fire, sky. And again, when the ancient Greeks come on the scene, they're running with that. And then we have the most important thing that comes out of that then is when people look at Greek philosophy, a lot of it is looking pretty similar in a lot of ways to what the ancient Egyptians had. And since many of the Greek philosophers spent a lot of time in ancient Egypt, then you've also got what's called the Memphite cosmology, where it starts with the deity Ptah and his power and spirit running through all things, animating all things, where he is the divine artificer, the divine potter. And if you look at the images of Ptah, he is shown like this, holding his staff. And if you look at the European American award ceremony, the Oscars, he's shown in the same way. So Oscar is based on Ptah. And then what came out of these ideas at a much later date, you had Thales claiming that water was the source of all things. You had the Greek philosopher Anaximander claiming that the origin of all things is the infinite or the unlimited. You had Anaximenes claiming that all things came from air, and Heraclitus teaching that fire is the underlying element in the universe. So in other words, all the ancient Greek philosophers did at the very beginning is just repeat what their ancient Egyptian teachers taught them. Now, for me, there is another lesson that I think the Black community needs to get with, and that is the importance of Thoth or Tehuti. And that's this. There's a branch of European scholarship called the Hermetica. And the Hermetica is the teachings of the god Hermes. And Hermes, as you know, is really a Greek version of the ancient Egyptian deity Tehuti. And the teachings of Hermes, they've evolved into what they call the 7 Hermetic principles. And the 7 Hermetic principles is the basis behind wealth and success philosophy. I've done some research into comparing, for example, the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, which is one of the preeminent success books. And you can see the 7 principles of Tehuti running through all of it. Even ancestralism is in that book, surprisingly enough. So one of the things then that people used ancient African ideas for, they used it practically as a success philosophy, as an achievement philosophy, as a you can do it philosophy. And you'll get people in areas of sports, industry, literature, creativity, using these principles as an aid to building success. And I think a lot of Black scholars dismiss the 7 Hermetic principles, the 7 principles of Tehuti, because they think, oh, well, it's been contaminated by European thought. But it's actually proved to be quite a useful body of information as well.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also the basis of that whole business of creativity. There's that whole the secret, what they call the secret, and the secret is simply really self-knowledge, which was the basis of all these 4 institutions that we're talking about, back there in Egypt, 3000 BC or what have you. And it's a way to get to your source, because as you go through the whole thing, like for example, in terms of Heliopolis, I mean, you have Atum Ra, which is the will of God, and then as you mentioned before, you have Shu and Tefnut. I interpret them slightly differently. I interpret Shu as fire, Nut as water, and then Tefnut as the air or movement or expansion, and Geb as contraction or matter. However you look at it, basically, those are the principles within space, which was created by Atum Ra. And then, of course, you go to the evolutionary aspect of it, where you end up then also now as with many different things. That's where Ptah comes in, and you end up with Ausar, Auset, Seth, Nephthys, and Heru. And that's how you end up with the 9. These 5, which are so you end up with these, 9 principles, which tell you all about evolution, and it also tells you that you're made in the image of God, because Atum Ra is what produced you, and he produced you as his highest product, and you are able as Ausar to be one with Atum, which is the sort of one God, if you will, that is hidden. And Amun means hidden, and Atum means the will. So see, these are all principles of divinity that we also possess, and that's the secret that is embedded in Kemetic cosmology and cosmogony, which, as you're saying, I don't think we understand enough of it as African people, but it's being applied by Europeans in these ways of success, growing rich, and the secret of life in terms of creativity, and that's what we have as African humans when we are in touch with our inner selves. We have this creativity that comes out. And that mirrors the creativity of the universe, and that's told when you go to Thebes in terms of the origin of time and the beginning of this whole cycle. One cycle that ended, I forget what the name of the serpent was, Erta or something like this, and then a new cycle started when this new serpent was broken open, shall we say, which is inertia, and then time started again for this new cycle. So, we have this understanding of the universe, the creation of the universe, the source of the creativity of the universe, how it came from consciousness and energy to matter, and all the principles that are behind it, because in all of this, Ma'at is the basic principle behind creation. And this is what human beings have to aspire to. And as you know, why don't you take us through the business, the shall we say, the death scene of the individual who goes into the hall of justice. Yeah, he's going to get his heart weighed, you know, and Ma'at is on one side, the feather in terms of the scales, and his heart has to balance this feather. So he has to be a disciple of Ma'at, or he will not, you know, go to the next phase, which is a higher form of life.
I think we missed something out, which I'll put in, and then we'll get to that if you don't mind.
Okay.
This is what it is. The Book of the Dead is a journey where you're tested and tested and tested at the behest of Osiris or Osar. And those tests are gruesome, and you have to emerge triumphant, and you have to stay righteous while you're being tested. And then the final test is when you then arrive at the Hall of the Two Truths. And what happens is you enter the hall. This is what the mythology says. And then you address the 42 judges and you say the sin that you didn't do. So people call it the negative confessions. I have not done iniquity. I have not stolen. I have not told lies, that kind of thing. And eventually you get to Osiris. Now, the judgment is where you've got Ma'at, who represents the female, and the male equivalent is Tehuti or Thoth. And Thoth is shown with a writing board with everything that you've ever done in your life written down. And what happens is you're judged. And the idea is, in the balance, your heart has to be as light as a feather. Now, what does it mean for your heart to be light? It means you have not got a sinful and heavy heart. And this idea of a sinful and heavy heart, it's almost like your heart and the feeling represents, if it represents heaviness, it means you've lived a guilty life. And so your life has to be, your heart has to be light so that it can symbolically balance something as light as a feather. And then the feather is one of the feathers, you know, we said that Ma'at is shown with wings. One of her feathers is then put in the other pan, and the two have to balance. And that symbolizes you having to live a righteous and therefore a guilt-free life. And if you can go past that, then that means you have emerged righteous. And that symbolizes, if you like, victory. That symbolizes, if you like, success, according to how the ancient Egyptians saw the world.
This is scattered, shall we say, through all of Egyptian society. I think what we're just talking about there was maybe the most elaborate version, and as you know, also another name for the book of the dead is the book of coming forth by day, and it's a choice of how you interpret it. I'm not fluent in hieroglyphics, but I prefer to think of it as the book of coming forth by day. Because I really believe that it is a book that is telling us how we have to live our life. And I think that the simpler version of that for the everyday man, and essentially is the oldest story, because I think it was older than the pyramid text, etc., is the story of Osar, Oset, and Heru. And you know, that whole, you know, story of Osar being the prototypical ancestor of Africa, of Kemet, Africa, and civilizing, you know, his people, and then going around the world, spreading civilization. And civilization meant meaning giving them government, agriculture and farming, and as well as animal husbandry and creating wine, etc. You know, all of these sort of goodies of life of that particular time. And then he went around the world and taught everybody else the civilization. In the meantime, his brother, Seth, who was very envious of him, was plotting to take over the kingdom, but he had left Isis in charge, or Outset. I prefer to say Outset, and her, yeah. So she was left in charge, and she managed the kingdom pretty well. But when he came back, as you know, the story goes that that Seth had prepared a sarcophagus, a beautiful sarcophagus, and they had a party, and everybody tried to fit into the sarcophagus, because whoever fit it was going to get it. It was a great gift, that would be buried in it. And of course, he had taken the measurements of Elsar before, and so on and so forth. So when he enticed Elsar to get into the sarcophagus, him and 72, I'm not sure the meaning of the 72, and the 72 buddies who had been scheming, they closed the lid down, hammered it shut, and I think they even poured melted lead or something like that, and then threw him into the Nile. So he was suffocated, as well as drowned, and there's that whole thing now of interpreting. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but both Outset and Nephthys, who was Seth's wife, but also a sister to Outset. So it's a family. In other words, it's your psyche. This is what the whole story means. It's the first story of understanding of the mind and what you have to do in terms of self-knowledge and to be able to shall we say, gain mastery over your mind, and therefore live righteously according to Ma'at. So anyway, she found the sarcophagus. Again, I won't go into details there. Brought his body back, but then Seth found it, and at night when he was hunting in the moon, and maybe some of the symbolism, cut it into 14 pieces, and I think that has to do with the moon and the waxing and the waning of the moon, whatever. And what she and Nephthys now went around the kingdom, finding all the pieces, and they found 13 pieces. They couldn't find a 14th, and the 14th piece had been thrown into the Nile and eaten by a particular fish, and that particular fish was not eaten by any Egyptian ever after. I don't remember the name of the fish, but I think what that symbolizes is that they were able to recollect, meaning remember, meaning that they put all of his pieces together. They remembered everything about Elsa, put it together, but not in a sexual way. It was not a sexual relationship either with Elsa or with Nephthys, but both had offsprings. And of course, so this was the divine conception. I think, again, this is the first story of that divine conception, I think, probably in the history of the world, I don't know. But Elsa gave birth to Heru, and Nephthys gave birth to a jackal, which is very interesting because the jackal is symbolic of transformation. And you may want to go into that because I think that's also very heavy in terms of the symbolism of the whole story. And then, of course, she nurtured a Horus in the swamps, etc., and grew him up. And again, what that means is that as part of the psyche, which is the part of our consciousness that deals with things, she is now developing that in terms of its ability to be strong, meaning that you can have focused attention. And this is the intentionality of the hero, Heru, because again, that's what Heru means. And he's going to go up and fight the villain. So he has to be strong, he has to have concentration. So that's what all of that is about. And then now he goes to battle with Seth, and it goes on for a long time, but the gods are tired of the whole business. And of course, we know gods are not gods. They're principles of divine principles of nature and functionalities. And again, we won't go into all the gods that were there, but they gave the kingdom eventually to Heru. Now, once Heru gained the kingdom, again, because of his understanding of himself, because of his ability to defeat Seth, which are all the negative things that we do as human beings. And so he now gained mastery of the kingdom, and the kingdom is your kingdom, your life. And then he goes to the underworld, which is the inner world. You see, and I think this is something I interpret it that way. The underworld is the inner world. he goes to the inner world and he resurrects Osar, his daddy, which is the part of him that was buried. It was buried when the coffin was shut. It was buried when he was drowned, but now Heru goes into the inner world, the underworld, and raises his dad up to life. That means now he's resurrecting really that part of himself that had been cut off because he was a young man doing whatever things that he was doing. So that is the first psychology, in terms of self-knowledge. And I think that's not recognized, and we hear about Freud starting this and Jung starting that and all these other psychological things, and they haven't even got there. They haven't even gotten to this because they don't understand that mind is not something real. It's just consciousness that has been conditioned. And Seth is the conditioned consciousness that you have to defeat and transform it. And then, of course, Seth was not killed, but Seth was used to carry Osar around the kingdom for millions of years. And of course, that means that the energy, et cetera, had been transformed into, shall we say, righteous energy, living the life of Maat and so on. And this is something, and I want just to get into this, is why I say that, spirituality is different from religion, because this now is a very personal approach to how you develop your self-understanding, develop your self-awareness, your self-knowledge, transform yourself, because nobody else can do it for you. The priest can't do it for you, et cetera, and much of the priesthood and much of the ritual is somewhat external to your own inner transformation that you have to do. And I know that you have some differences there, but I think it's not real. Well, I'll let you do your thing in terms of how you see spirituality different from religion. Perhaps also comment on that story in terms of any other insights that you have relative to its meaning.
The interpretation that you've given the Egyptian story of Horus, Set, Isis, and so on, a lot more Black scholarship needs to have this kind of discussion and have the discussion on what exactly do the symbols mean. The interpretation that you've given is a very, very powerful interpretation, is a very, very useful interpretation. But the main problem that we have is that the ancient Egyptian story of Isis and Set, Osiris, that kind of thing, most of what we have isn't what the ancient Egyptians said, it's what the ancient Europeans said about what the ancient Egyptians said. A lot of it is coming from a source, a scholar called Plutarch, who wrote a book called On Isis and Osiris. And what you've said, that's where that's coming from. Now you can map it against, okay, this is what we see on the Egyptian temple walls, and we can map this against that. But it does mean that the spiritual meanings of the different symbolism in the story, Black scholars need to have a much, much deeper discussion. And your interpretation is a very, very powerful one. And the meaning behind the symbols is a very, very powerful one. And what I would do is invite other scholars to have that discussion, this particular part of the story, what symbol, what meaning, or what interpretations we can put on it, because what you've come with is powerful. All right, let me point out a few observations of my own. You've got the idea of, according to Plato, you've got Isis fearing for the life of her child Osiris, Isis making a box from papyrus and reed and hiding the child in the River Nile, where it floats down and then ends up in Byblos. Byblos is in the Middle East. And then you've got Isis.
I think it's Lebanon.
Yeah. And then what you then get is Isis finding the box and so on. And a lot of people have looked at that story and isn't that the Moses story floating down the river Nile? And then, not to be outdone, one of the Middle Eastern civilizations called the Akkadians. Let me read what an Akkadian source says. My city is Azupiranu, which lieth on the bank of the Euphrates. My poor mother conceived me. In secret, she brought me forth. She set me in a basket of rushes. With bitumen, she closed my door. She cast me into the river. The river bore me up unto Aki, the irrigator, and the goddess Ishtar came to protect me.
Mhm.
So this is one of the Middle Eastern kings, the king of Sargon, of Akkad, and apparently he was floating down the river Euphrates. And then that became their version of the story until the goddess Ishtar came to rescue this child that was in this basket floating down the Euphrates. And you can see where later religions are coming from. But the key point, what do the symbols mean? And in my opinion, what you have, put it down on paper, seriously. Get a debate and a discourse around it, because the psychological symbolisms of what each symbol means, we need to have a discussion about that.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's fundamental because, this is my interpretation. Part of it is intuitive, and part of it is, scholarship on my part in terms of trying to understand what different people have said and seeing what is the basis of their saying so. And Charlotte de Lubis is somebody that I respect a fair amount in terms of his understanding of Egypt. And I'm sure you know his work. He spent like 17 years or something in the different temples in Luxor and different places, going through all kinds of stuff. And my only negative with him is that he thought the Egyptians came from somewhere else. They weren't black people.
Indeed. And it's amazing that someone can do 17 years and come to that conclusion.
I mean, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. And his whole family, Lucy Lamy, who was the stepdaughter, and so on and so forth. I mean, to me, they have a beautiful understanding of what the symbolism means. He calls it symbolique and so on and so forth. And this is what is important, you see, because as you know, shall we say, certain areas of human experience, which are beyond words and beyond concepts, therefore they can't be described. And a full understanding of yourself in the spiritual sense. Okay, different people have tried to describe it, but you can't. It's just undescribable. So the only way you can convey it is through symbol and allegory. And that's what the ancient Egyptians did. And that's why they never wanted to let go of their hieroglyphics, because that was their sacred writing. I mean, they had what's the other, Merotic and so on, but they never let go of their hieroglyphic, which was the sacred language, which is the language that dealt really with the invisible and the undescribable. So how they used that in terms of trying to interpret and understand is that they saw functional principles in the different animals and the different plants in their existence. Like, for example, they would use the crocodile to represent, shall we say, strength and destruction. They would use the hippopotamus to represent, a pregnant mother, giving birth. I mean, what can be more, like a pregnant mother than a big hippo? I hope the ladies forgive me for that one. And as I mentioned, the jackal. A jackal is like one of those fierce dogs or what have you, and eats the rotten meat and so on, but transforms it into nourishment for himself. So that's that whole transformation process that you can imbibe something, or you can be something, but you can transform yourself into something that's better. So the symbolism is just wonderful. And it's an indication of the understanding of the basic principles of life. And this is not what the West has come to. They do not attempt to understand principles in terms of source and origin. All they are interested in, well, how does it function at the present time? What are the different parts? How do they work together? You see, and then they replace this part with that part, and okay, I can make it more efficient, or I can do this, or I can do that. And it ends up that if what may be considered an improvement over time may be destructive of a particular ecosystem of which that thing is a part. And we have that in our agriculture now with all of the fungicides and the herbicides and all the other stuff that they put in the earth to give a bigger yield, the fertilizers, et cetera, et cetera. And then you wear out the earth in a particular short period of time because you're not replenishing it with compost and so on and so forth. So these are things that I think are important for us to understand. And I think, it was laid out for us then what is, I hate to use the word, but it's almost criminal, but I think it's based on ignorance, is the way that so-called Egyptologists have looked at this wonderful source of wisdom that goes back for thousands of years. And all they have to say is, well, these people worship animals, and oh my God, what kind of stupid people are they? I mean, how can you come to that kind of conclusion when these people...
Let me jump in.
Yeah, please.
I get it. I get it. Look at it from an Egyptological perspective, all right? This is what we have access to. You've got on one hand the philosophical ideas of the ancient Egyptians as represented by Ptah-hotep and all the other wisdom teachings. By themselves, those wisdom teachings give you a guidance for what is considered a right action. And there's a whole body of moral philosophy, and for that matter, political philosophy that comes out of it. The easy way to deal with that is to say, well, they worshipped animals. Then you have the cosmological ideas that you've talked about, the Hermopolitan cosmology, the Heliopolitan one, the Theban one, the Memphite one. Well, you can just dismiss that as hocus pocus.
They dismiss it as each one fighting against the other one.
That's right.
They're parts of the same thing.
That's right. But you can then dismiss its significance, even though, as we've seen, it's the basis of Greek philosophy. Then you have what's symbolized by the Book of the Dead, or Coming Forth by Day, and how it teaches persistence. How it teaches that you will continue to be judged, and you will be judged within an inch of your life, and you still have to emerge triumphant. That's a whole nother discussion. Then we have what you said about the interpretation of the story of Isis and Osiris and all the symbolisms and psychology involved in that, and that has its own discussion. Then we have the 7 principles of Tehuti and all the power and symbolism there, and how that's the basis of success philosophy. And we haven't even finished yet, because there's another area too. When Dr. Naim Akbar wrote The Nile Valley Origins of the Science of the Mind, what Akbar did was to show that when it comes to what makes up a human being, he's since developed the idea into the community of the self. But when he first wrote about it, he talked about the importance of a ka, a ba, a kaibit, a sa, all these different elements that make up a human being. And these different elements means that you can define a human being as perhaps 7 different things, as perhaps 10 different things. And when you have Greek and the tradition of European philosophy that's developed ever since, through the likes of René Descartes, about is it physical or is it metaphysical? Is it mind? Is it body? Yeah. And you've got the ancient Egyptians saying, well, actually, it's 7 different things. It's the ka, it's the ba, it's the kaibit, it's the sa. Does that make sense? Yeah. And these principles, is Professor Naim Akbar correct to say that each of those principles is a different thing that makes up a human being, a different aspect of the self? And if it does mean that, how does that change our understanding of psychology?
Mhm. Mhm.
So can you see that there's at least 6 different ways that
Mhm.
we can interpret ancient Egyptian thought? And there's 6 different ways we can pull out psychological principles, spiritual principles, wealth principles, success principles, persistence principles. Do you see?
Yeah. Yeah.
And all of that exists within this body of knowledge. What an amazingly rich body of knowledge.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what keeps astounding me, because when you get to a deeper understanding, you understand more and more how it applies to everything, and life becomes relatively simple, because when you solve your own problems internally, then you don't project those problems on the external world outside of you. But because that's exactly what all of us do in terms of our mind. The world that we see is all mind. It's interpreted as, for us by our minds. And the world that we see is not the same world that the dog sees or the elephant sees, or maybe that the Chinese person sees the world a little bit different from the African person, and the European person for sure sees the world differently from the African person, and so on. And that's because of a mental conditioning. And all of these principles that you're talking about are extremely important. And of course the one that was the one that then shall we say is worthy of the gods and lives with the gods is the Ak, which is the light, so to speak. When you have gotten rid of all of your inconsistencies and your conditioning and so on, and you're just really light, which, as you know, that's the symbol, shall we say, of clarity, of consciousness. It's pure consciousness and energy. So yes, I'm somewhat familiar with Nine Makbar's work, and there's certain little differences in terms of which name means what. The Ba means the soul, and so on, and the Ka seems to mean more the physical energy part that doesn't seem to leave the cat, and the cat is the body that's is embalmed and so on, but the Ka seems to somewhat hover around where the body is buried, as opposed to the Ba, which becomes liberated and so on and so forth. So,
and that's where the idea of the coming forth by days. It's your Ba coming forth by day.
Yeah.
And can you see it's the Count Dracula story in reverse? Dracula disappears before day. Yeah. So you can see how other people are taking the story and twisting it to create their own ideas out of it.
Yes. The original wisdom is there. I think we've begun to unearth some of it that is of extreme relevance. But what has also happened is that it's as if to say of the way in which Egyptian civilization, and I'm saying that Egyptian civilization now because they've gone away from calling it Kemet because of the Arab invasion, and it's been Arabized and so on. It's to say that doesn't belong to the rest of Africa, that didn't come out of Africa, and that the understanding that was developed and perfected in Kemet was not transmitted across the continent. I think I'm going to want us to go there next time in terms of some of that transmission. I think we started doing that a little bit in terms of Krishna and Buddha. I think I want us to do that, because I think it's important to understand that, there's one basic understanding of our humanity. And others have taken that basic understanding that we transmitted around the world, and they have divided up the world into different peoples and different territories, and of course then there are different belief systems and different religions. And I guess we'll come back to maybe next time we'll start with the difference between religion and spirituality, because I think that's a useful discussion for us to have in depth. And I think in depth probably I won't disagree with you, but I like to focus on spirituality because I think that's something that you can do for yourself, as opposed to religion. being more of a structured thing. And of course, religion, even when it has the same principles as another religion, has developed a cultural covering, shall we say, that has developed over time because of the physicality and the history of that particular place, that particular people. So that this, even though this religion and that religion may have similar basic principles, but they don't recognize each other because of the cultural overlays, and that's one of the problems with religion. But as you've said before, certainly the ethical component to religion is significant, but of course that's also a part of spirituality. How you function in society is based on the values and the ethics of, as we are saying here, it's certainly ma'at, which is honesty and righteousness and reciprocity, and so on. So I think that'll be a useful discussion. And again, I want us to move across Africa. We certainly know that the Dogon were beneficiaries of Egyptian civilization. I think the Yoruba also tell us that, and I think we need to look at that because it's interesting to see migration within Africa, because most of the time we think of migration outside of Africa, and there's a tendency to disconnect Egypt from Africa itself. And I want to sort of reconnect that.
You're right. They do try to do that.
Yes. Yeah. So I enjoyed our discussion today. Look forward to the next one. So,
Very much so.
Good. Wonderful. Thanks for all the information.